I want you to imagine two very different days. On the first day, you've had a bad cold, you haven't been sleeping well. Because you felt crummy, you've been eating bad food to kind of self-soothe. You haven't been working out, and you haven't been meditating. You wake up in the morning exhausted again. You didn't sleep very well because your nose was all stuffed up. You look out the window, and it's 33 degrees and raining. You manage to drag yourself out of bed, and if you live with somebody, you go into the kitchen and you have one of those 5-minute interactions with a friend or a loved one that can ruin your whole day. You know, the kind where you get off really on the wrong foot. And you take a look at your appointment book and you realize that you're meeting with way too many people, and a lot of them aren't your favorites. And it's with this as a backdrop that you drag yourself out to your car and you start driving to work. On the way to work, you're driving, and very subtly at first you hear and feel thump, thump, thump. But as time goes on, it starts to become thump, 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 and you realize you have a flat tire. And you just have this overwhelming feeling of, I can't believe it, not today, I just can't take it. Now I'd like you to imagine a completely different day. You've been healthy, you've been working out, you've been meditating regularly. You wake up in the morning quite refreshed after a long and deep sleep because this time you had the wisdom to go to bed early enough. You look out the window and it's 68 degrees and the sun is shining. And if you live with somebody, you go into the kitchen and you have one of those 5-minute interactions with a friend or a loved one that just makes you so happy to have somebody else in your life, to have connections, to have other people. And you look at your appointment book and it's a Goldilocks day for whatever kind of work or recreational activity you're involved in. Not so many activities that you're going to be exhausted, not few that you can either starve or feel bored. And as you look at names of some of the people you're going to be with that day, you realize that a lot of them, if they're not already your close personal friends, if you're working with them professionally, you'd like to have them as your close personal friends. And it's with this as a backdrop that you go on and get into your car and start heading for work. And on the way to work, you're enjoying the day, you're being very mindful, and you stop at a red light, and suddenly you feel, bam, and you realize you've been hit from behind. You take a moment and you realize, oh, I seem to be okay. You look over, the other driver's already pulling their car over, they seem to be okay, and you just have this profound sense of, you know, thank God, it's just going to be metal and plastic and some money, but it'll all be all right. Now, on the first day, the intensity of the experience was relatively moderate. Down here, it was a flat tire on a rainy day, but your capacity to bear experience was lower still, so you felt overwhelmed. On the second day, the intensity of the experience was considerably higher than that, right? It was an automobile accident, but your capacity to bear experience was higher still. So the net result was you felt it was okay, it was no big deal. Any event that brings up reactions that are stronger than our felt capacity to experience them can become traumatic. Often, when the experience is too intense, we push feelings out of awareness. We either repress or suppress them, and then they show up as symptoms. Now, many of our psychiatric interventions are actually designed to make us feel better by reducing the intensity of unpleasant experiences. Mindfulness practices instead increase our capacity to bear experience rather than decreasing the intensity of the experience. They prepare us to be able to better handle whatever good or bad fortune may come our way. Let's step back and look a little bit at what happens during traumas, both small traumas and the larger ones. Joyful and fulfilling aspects of life are inextricably intertwined with experiences of pain and loss. Some people's adversities are especially hurtful and destabilizing. Many children have been abused, unloved, or abandoned. Many adults have endured disasters, war, assaults, torture, or traumatic deaths of loved ones. The incidence of these adverse events is much higher than most people imagine. A large study of patients at Kaiser Permanente, which is a health maintenance organization, was designed to assess childhood exposure to multiple types of adverse events, to abuse, to neglect, to domestic violence, and serious household dysfunction such as substance abuse. The researchers derived what they called an ACE score, an Adverse Childhood Event, or ACE score. And they gave 1 point for each major category of abuse, neglect, or other difficulty somebody had experienced. They found in this normal population of adults, just regular folks signed up at a health center, 2/3 of the population report at least one adverse childhood event. Actually, 26% had one event, 16% had 2 events, and 27% had 3 or more of these serious events. And this doesn't even include the traumas that happen after childhood. They also found that these adverse childhood events had a huge impact on well-being, with higher ACE scores corresponding to more of life's problems. Compared to people with an ACE score of 0, those with a score of 4 or more were twice as likely to be smokers, 12 times more likely to have attempted suicide, 7 times more likely to be alcoholic, and 10 times more likely to have injected street drugs. Childhood trauma sets us up for trouble later on. But what exactly makes these events traumatic? Why do they so negatively affect our well-being, even years after the adverse event? When a painful event or loss is of significant and sufficient magnitude, it pushes us into an emergency state. It activates our fight, freeze, or flight system, which we then experience as great anxiety, and it usually narrows our awareness to immediate survival. We just think, how am I going to get through this? Memories are formed, and these memories carry with them all sorts of emotions, thoughts, and sensations that become associated with the event. And then these memories can be triggered and relived as flashbacks, as intrusive thoughts, or simply as painful feelings and other aspects of post-traumatic stress. Sometimes these memories are continuously activated, leading to chronic anxiety, depression, or chronic anger. And these events can also change the assumptions most of us carry about ourselves, about our safety, about the future, and often about the goodness of other people. Trauma can completely upend our world. A rape, a heart attack, or a traumatic loss can leave us feeling entirely alone, irrevocably changed, and flooded with an awareness of the fragility of life and how hard well-being can be to obtain. When we're faced with such difficult experiences, most of us, either consciously or unconsciously, try to avoid the thoughts, feelings, and memories about what happened. So we try to suppress them. We might, and often do, engage in addictive behaviors like the ones we discussed in the last lecture, or even engage in harmful acts toward ourselves or others. Now, of course, during a crisis, it can be very useful to block out feelings in order to cope with immediate challenges and demands of the situation, to do what needs to be done. But in the long run, this tends to make matters worse, both by causing all sorts of distressing symptoms and also by robbing us of the opportunity to integrate the painful experience. A good deal of research shows that trauma survivors who use drugs or alcohol, who dissociate, which means basically to space out, externalize, see problems as out there, or engage in denial or suppression of upsetting thoughts are more likely to develop intrusive and chronic post-traumatic problems and syndromes. It appears that what's happening is that the avoided material can't be processed and resolved. As one Zen teacher and psychologist put it, what we cannot hold, we cannot process. What we cannot process, we cannot transform, and what we cannot transform haunts us. Or a bit more succinctly, as one of my patients once said, when we bury feelings, we bury them alive. Now, other people's reactions, including all sorts of cultural assumptions about how to handle things, often makes things worse. As a mental health professional, I hear stories about this all the time. Like the Iraqi woman who couldn't mention her rape and kept it secret from her husband and other family members for decades because it was so shameful in her culture. Or the divorced Cambodian woman who couldn't find refuge in her community. Apparently the word for divorcee in Cambodian is something like refuse, like garbage. She both felt and was treated like garbage and had no family or friends to turn to. Now, sometimes we block out feelings connected not only to major adverse events, but also feelings connected to smaller, emotionally painful experiences. In fact, most of what we call stress is actually the tension that comes from trying to push little traumas out of awareness, little feelings that were a little bit too much to bear at the time and that we distracted from or withdrew from in the moment. Now, whether or not an event is experienced as traumatic depends on the ratio between our capacity to handle the pain when it occurs and the intensity of the pain, just what I was talking about with the flat tire or the automobile accident. If our capacity to handle it is very high, even if the pain is pretty high, we're okay. But if our capacity to handle it is low, we become overwhelmed, we push it out of awareness, and it becomes a trauma. Now, we all receive many messages that encourage us to bury painful thoughts, feelings, and memories. They teach us to deal with emotional pain and uncomfortable states through behaviors that distract or suppress or numb us. Other people may say after a while to just get over it, put your past behind you, or move on already. And there are certainly endless ads promoting pain relievers and all sorts of medications to fix simple discomfort. We're even encouraged to buy all sorts of consumer products to feel better or to get rid of feelings of inadequacy or dissatisfaction. The message we hear over and over in all sorts of forms is that pain, distress, and dissatisfaction are bad things that we should get rid of, medicate, or distract ourselves from. And we come to expect that if only we would do that and get rid of those things, stop feeling bad, we would by definition feel good. The problem is that the mind doesn't actually work this way. As my friend and colleague, the psychologist John Briere at the University of Southern California says, the way the mind actually works is a pain paradox. Research shows us that in general, those who are able to more directly experience their distress, whether through mindfulness practice, through psychotherapy, or other ways of being with traumatic memory, are likely to experience less distress over time. It seems that being with non-overwhelming psychological pain allows the mind to integrate traumatic or upsetting material until it no longer needs to intrude into consciousness. So when we're in distress, to the best extent possible, we should consider doing the exact opposite of what we and others may want us to do. That is, we should consider directly feeling the painful states and/or even thinking the painful thoughts. I know this sounds odd, but we should avoid avoidance. Or as a Zen master said, invite your fear to tea. You may notice we're back again to the story of the Zen master who can be run through with the sword without blinking an eye. It's about using mindfulness practice to increase our ability to stay with discomfort, both by practicing not scratching the itch or adjusting to fix the ache when we're doing our meditation practice, and by seeing emotions as impersonal events that arise and pass in the mind and body. This is also, like we discussed in treating the snake phobia, we use mindfulness practices to engage in a form of therapeutic exposure and response prevention. Practicing being with experiences in mindfulness practices desensitizes us to the difficult material and decreases its capacity to overwhelm us. By experiencing our traumatic memories with less judgment and with more simply awareness of present experience with acceptance, their effects are less likely to be exacerbated by catastrophizing, by shame, by guilt, by all the stories we add on top of it. And the less disturbing memories then require less avoidance, and they increase psychological exposure and processing. A kind of virtuous cycle gets set up that eventually helps us to integrate the traumatic event. Here again, we're learning to see thoughts as just thoughts, developing what cognitive behavior theorists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to simply see thinking as it is. And as we see these intrusive thoughts as just words, images, and body sensations, we have less to be afraid or angry about. We start to see the triggered thoughts as old tapes or just trauma talking. And we see the avoidance strategies like withdrawing from activities or substance abuse as far less appealing and necessary. Now, there are actually two pretty independent sources of distress that are associated with traumatic experience. The first is the one we've just been discussing, the memories of the event itself and the pain that's associated with it. The second is the suffering that's associated with our attempts to maintain our previous models or views of ourself, of others, of the world, of our basis for happiness. And mindfulness practice can also help us with the second difficulty as well. Imagine, for example, what might happen after a heart attack. Now, a heart attack may involve great physical pain, but it also tends to challenge our beliefs and expectations about our health, about our immortality, and perhaps later, when we're recovering, all of our assumptions about autonomy and being able to be independent, assumptions about financial security, our future generally, and the idea of having a life without pain or illness all get challenged. The psychological shock of these realities may be at least as hard to deal with as the pain and terror associated with a physically injured heart. Mindfulness practices, by helping us to notice how all phenomena are in constant flux, can help us to recognize more clearly the inevitability of things like illness, aging, change, and even death. So we're not so shocked to learn about them. We're then less likely to be traumatized by life's misfortunes. Now, the processing of trauma is quite different depending on its source. There have been many studies that show that people find it far easier to integrate traumatic experiences that come from natural disasters than those that are caused by other people, those that are perpetrated by other people's misdeeds. When it's a natural disaster, assuming the problem wasn't that humans didn't respond adequately, then there's no one else to blame, there's no shame involved, it's not a personal event. It's experienced as an impersonal event, and it usually affected not just us, but a wide number of people. This leads to appreciation of what in Buddhist terms is called dependent origination. And this is a term to describe the fact that all things come from causes and conditions. Every event that happens because other events caused it to happen. It's very easy to see in meteorology. The hurricane happened because of the various forces in the world at the moment, and it really wasn't anybody's fault. But what's interesting is the same view of dependent origination can even apply to traumas that are caused by other people, and that has a way of transforming them quite radically. So from this perspective, there are 4 steps to working with trauma. The first is to open to the painful emotions and memories. The second is to explore the facts of the trauma. The third is going to be to see it through the lens of dependent origination, and I'll explain that in some detail in a moment. And then finally, to develop compassion toward ourselves and the others who are involved. The first 2 are actually more on the level of what I called earlier relative truth, the way we think about life in general. We're simply going to open to the painful emotions and explore the facts of the trauma. The second, or the third and the fourth, are really about absolute truth. Can we step back and look at things not from a personal perspective, but as from the perspective of impersonal factors and forces unfolding in the world? Let's look at these in some detail through the experience of one of my patients who had a very traumatic childhood experience. And this childhood experience, ironically, was brought about by his own actions, but as we'll see, his own actions were brought about in many ways by his situation. This, in disguised form, is Tom's story. Now, Tom was raised by a very neglectful aunt, and he turned to his sister for comfort. His sister was only about a year younger. And this turning to one another for comfort eventually morphed into having some sexual encounters. Now, one day, his older cousin with whom he lived walked in on him with his sister. Didn't say a word, but from then on, the cousin tormented him throughout his adolescence. The cousin was like a big man on campus in high school, and he made sure that Tom was rejected by everybody. Eventually, Tom found himself completely ostracized by the family in which he had grown up. So how to work with this from this mindful perspective? Well, we begin by working with opening to painful emotions, to simply gradually process the thoughts and feelings with acceptance to the degree to which we can of all of the feelings of distress. And the way we do that is by revisiting the painful event and noticing exactly what comes up in the heart and mind. We notice in this process that the bad feelings are not bad in the sense of unuseful, they're simply painful, even though it's normal and healthy for them to come up. And it's very important when doing this not to push for any kind of premature closure or forgiveness or anything. It's really about just staying with the hard feelings, including feelings of hatred, disgust, shame, desires for retribution, whatever comes up, because these are all perfectly understandable human reactions to trauma. What happened to Tom was he noticed that he felt like a freak, like a pariah, and he spent his entire life vulnerable to being found out, afraid that people would discover what he'd done with his sister. The second step is to really explore the facts and to explore them objectively. Kind of like if you remember the old show Dragnet, the way Friday used to speak. Just the facts, ma'am. You want to really try to remember what happened, and then look at whatever conclusions we might have formed about ourselves and about others who were involved at the time of the event, including all of the self-blaming conclusions. And the goal is to really see things as they are. For Tom, this involved recalling that his sister was actually a willing and active participant in their times together, and recalling his own desperation and loneliness, how he had nowhere to turn to. The next stage, and this is where we get more directly into mindfulness practice and the implications of Buddhist psychology, is we try to look at the event through the lens of dependent origination. This has to do with our whole notions of blame and even of good and evil. Let me explain. At what age would you start blaming another person for his or her behavior? If a 6-month-old baby starts carrying on, crying, or acting upset or keeping us up at night, we don't usually think that the baby's doing it willfully or that the baby's a bad person. We think, well, they must be wet, or they're sick, or maybe teething early. We try to figure out what are the factors and forces causing this. By the time the baby is 6 years old, well, we might go back and forth between thinking, if they're misbehaving, they're doing it willfully, rotten kid, or we might be thinking, what's making my child do this? By 16, if somebody's behaving badly, it's quite easy to start blaming them and judging them for it. This is actually connected to the very idea of evil, because evil is predicated on the idea that if we had the exact same genetics and the exact same environmental history as the other person, we'd somehow behave differently. And yet scientific psychologists trying to understand human behavior see human behavior as the result of genetics interacting with environment over the course of a life. So the idea of evil suggests there's something other than this going on. When we start looking at things through the lens of dependent origination, we realize, no, all behavior really is the result of these things. I remember seeing the head of Bridgewater State Hospital being interviewed on TV when he was retiring. And that was the hospital that treats the criminally insane in Massachusetts. And he said in his 25 years running this institution, he never once met an inmate who had done something heinous, who hadn't him or herself, I guess it was all guys there, hadn't himself been abused. So we start to consider the whys of the event. Why did we come to the conclusions we did? Why did the perpetrator do what he or she did? In fact, were there reasons, we're not talking about justifications, but simply reasons why this happened, or was the perpetrator intrinsically evil? It gets us to think about why people do what they do. And this may lead to a slow transition from seeing ourselves as having deserved or caused the event and seeing the perpetrator as evil to seeing all of what unfolded as a natural consequence of some very difficult factors, forces, and conditions. We start to see the perpetrator as someone whose behavior arose from his own predispositions, difficulties, and adverse history. For Tom, this was very important because Tom was the victim and the perpetrator here. So for Tom, it was recalling that the aunt was either absent or critical throughout his whole childhood. There was no love or safety to be found, and it made sense that they would turn to one another. Now, the fourth stage, and the trickiest, involves developing compassion. And this means growing a sense of caring for oneself and maybe even, perhaps, an appreciation for the suffering of the perpetrator. And compassion rests on the notion that we humans are all in the same predicament and that we're all struggling the best we can given the hand we've been dealt. Ultimately then, awareness of dependent origination can reduce our emotional responses associated with seeing the perpetrator as intrinsically bad. For Tom, this was realizing that what he did was actually a natural consequence of the situation. I remember giving him at one point a book written for clinicians about children who have sexual contact with other children that's inappropriate. And the book was quite clear. All of the research said virtually all of these kids who do this do it because they're in dire straits emotionally and they're in adverse environments. He also came to see his cousin's sadistic reaction as a natural response to being in that same environment. And even began to view the aunt's neglect as the kids as coming out of her own history of neglect. Now, in doing this work, timing is vitally important, because you can't rush things. And if we try to move from what a person's actually feeling into these more advanced stages of letting go, or even for that matter, moving into remembering the situation vividly when we're not ready to do that, we can become quite overwhelmed. We discussed this earlier in talking about modifying the practices to suit our own needs. In treating trauma, you always have to start with safety. Until a person feels safe in their current situation, then trying to reintegrate the split-off feelings and look at them in a new light is really counterindicated. And this means having a decent living environment, maybe enough economic security, and some support of friends, family, perhaps a therapist or a therapy group. You have to be able to feel that you can manage your feelings before delving into them. Of course, whether we're using mindfulness practices to develop more safety, or to integrate thoughts, feelings, and images that we may have pushed out of awareness, continued practice is key. And that's why I've been reminding you throughout the course to regularly engage in both informal practice and formal meditation practice between the lectures. Because unless we have the regular practice to draw upon, it's very hard to use the mindfulness practices to deal with these difficult circumstances. So just to review quickly, the things that help us establish safety are usually things that have an outer focus: walking meditation, listening meditation, nature meditation, eating meditation, and open-eyed practices generally. They're actually called grounding activities in the trauma field, and they can be used whenever we're in crisis or just to strengthen the sense of safety in the present moment. We can also do things like the mountain meditation, which is included as an audio recording with the course, or metta or loving kindness practices, which are also available there. We only want to turn toward the sharp points when we're really ready. And that's moving toward the trauma-related experience, perhaps following those 4 steps that I outlined earlier. And as we're doing that, we always focus on how whatever we're investigating is felt right now in the body: the pain, the fear, the sadness, or the anger, the traumatic images or memories. Our ultimate goal is integration. We can in fact think of integration psychologically as health. When memories are no longer split off or suppressed, when the heart and the head, the feelings and cognitions are all connected, and when mind and body are connected. And with integration, we become comfortable with ourselves. We become comfortable with our mammalian nature, with our sexuality, with our aggression, with all of our body functions, with all of our instincts, as well as with all of our emotional responses to what's happened to us. This ultimately leads to a kind of spiritual development, in integration between who we think we are and other people and the wider universe or the wider world. But again, we can only do this work when a person is ready for it. The reason we split off feelings, why we disintegrate, is because the feelings were too hard to bear at the time. They were too difficult to integrate. So we always have to do this in a thoughtful way, sensing what somebody's ready for or not ready for. Now, keeping in mind this important caveat, that we need safety first, need to have a stable life first, you may want to try a simple integration exercise that goes by the acronym RAIN, R-A-I-N. And you can use this with any trauma-related difficulty, whether a big one or a small one. It's actually taught by many different meditation teachers. So this is the R-A-I-N, or RAIN practice. The R stands for recognize what's happening. So just take a few moments to experience your breath. And whatever feeling or sensation that's around which is difficult to be with, simply recognize it. Notice what it is. And be with it for a few moments. Just breathe with whatever the experience is. And then we can move on to the A, which is to allow. Allow life and experience to be just as it is. So once we recognize what's happening, we practice allowing it to be there, not trying to change it or fix it or solve it in any way, just allowing the feeling to be there. I stands for investigate, and it's about investigating the inner experience with kindness. So once you've recognized and allowed the experience, have an attitude of curiosity to feel exactly what it's about, what's happening here and now. Be curious. And then finally, N is non-identification or natural awareness, to simply see whatever's happening in the mind and body as the impersonal phenomena that it is. Simply allow it to be. So we recognize what's happening, allow it to be just as it is, then investigating it with kindness, and then not identifying with it, just resting in natural awareness. There are a lot of studies showing promise for using mindfulness practice to work through the effects of trauma. A number have been done recently with veterans with PTSD that have some very promising findings. Given the number of people who have been afflicted by trauma, both large and small, it's really nice to know that mindfulness practices can give us an effective way to work with them. In our next lecture, we're going to look at some mindfulness-based programs that have been shown to help people with a wide variety of behavioral and psychological problems. Understanding the components of these pioneering approaches will help us see different ways that we might use mindfulness practices to work with the difficulties we encounter in our own lives. Thanks for listening.